Imagine you are 18 years old. You're freezing in a dark, snow-covered forest, thousands of miles from your home, holding a rifle you've never actually had to fire in real combat. Your hands are numb, your breath is turning to ice in the winter air, and the silence around you is almost deafening. And then, you hear it. A deep, mechanical rumble echoing through the trees. The unmistakable screech of metal tracks grinding against the frozen earth. You don't know it yet, but you and 17 other kids, farm boys from places like Missouri, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, are about to stand directly in the path of the most ruthless, heavily armed, and arrogant commander in Adolf Hitler's entire military. At the time, no one realized that the fate of the entire Western Front was about to rest on the shoulders of these 18 teenagers. The Allied generals didn't know. The enemy didn't know. What these boys were about to face would change the course of the war completely. But how they responded to it shocked the entire world. It was December 1944. The place was the Ardennes forest, a quiet, heavily wooded sector along the border of Belgium and Germany. The American High Command called this area the Ghost Front. It was considered a totally inactive sector, a place where exhausted divisions were sent to rest, and where brand new, completely green units were sent to get used to the cold. Enter the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment. They were led by a guy named Lyle Bauch. Lyle was just 20 years old, making him one of the youngest commissioned officers in the entire United States Army. And the guys under his command? They were even younger. Most were 18 or 19. They were fresh out of high school, drafted off family farms and out of small towns. They had no combat experience. They were essentially just kids playing soldiers in the snow. But what they didn't know was that just a few miles away, hidden under the thick, freezing fog, the German war machine was assembling something terrifying. Adolf Hitler had secretly gathered his last great reserve of tanks, artillery, and elite soldiers for a massive surprise attack. The goal was to slice right through the Ardennes, split the British and American armies in half, and capture the port of Antwerp. If this plan worked, it could force the Allies to negotiate a peace treaty. And spearheading this entire massive assault was a man named Joachim Paper. Paper was the golden boy of the German High Command. He was an elite Panzer commander who had spent years on the brutal Eastern Front. He was heavily decorated, fiercely loyal, and most of all, he was arrogant. Paper had been given the newest, most heavily armored tanks in the world, the King Tigers, and thousands of battle-hardened veterans. When Paper looked at the map of the American lines, he laughed. He knew the soldiers holding the line in front of him were inexperienced, untested, and practically blind in the winter fog. He believed the Americans were soft. He thought they lacked discipline, and he was absolutely convinced that the moment his massive iron column rolled out of the fog, these farm boys would drop their weapons and run for their lives. His orders were strict: push through the American lines without stopping, maintain a ruthless timetable, and let nothing slow down the Panzer spearhead. On the morning of December 16th, the quiet of the Ghost Front shattered. At 5:30 a.m., thousands of German artillery shells rained down on the American positions. The ground shook violently. Trees were splintered into millions of flying toothpicks. The barrage lasted for hours, completely severing American telephone wires and destroying their radios. The farm boys in the Ardennes were entirely cut off. Nobody knew what was happening and nobody was coming to help them. When the shelling finally stopped, an eerie, terrifying silence fell over the forest. The fog was so thick you couldn't see 30 feet in front of you. Lyle Bauch and his 18 men were positioned on a small ridge overlooking a tiny village called Lanzerath. They had spent days digging deep, perfectly camouflaged foxholes, covering them with pine logs and dirt. They were practically invisible. As the fog began to thin out just a little, Bauch looked down the ridge. And his blood ran cold. Marching down the road, completely casual, was an entire battalion of elite German paratroopers. There were hundreds of them. They weren't even marching in combat formation. They had their weapons slung over their shoulders, chatting and smoking cigarettes. They were so confident that the artillery barrage had wiped out any American resistance that they were practically taking a morning stroll. And right behind them, waiting to advance, was Joachim Paper's massive armored column. Bauch looked at his men. They were terrified. They were outnumbered roughly 30-1. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery, and no way to call for backup. The German column was getting closer. 50 yards. 40 yards. 30 yards. Bauch raised his hand. His men aimed their rifles through the tiny slits in their log-covered foxholes, their fingers trembling on the triggers. If Bauch dropped his hand, they would give away their perfectly hidden position and face the full wrath of thousands of elite German soldiers. But if he didn't, the enemy would march right through, and the entire American army would be caught by surprise. The first German soldier was now just 20 yards away. Bulge took a deep breath, and he dropped his hand. The forest absolutely erupted. The 18 American boys opened up with everything they had. Rifles, a few submachine guns, and a single-mounted .50 caliber machine gun tore into the German column. The effect was immediate and devastating. Because the Americans were so well hidden and firing from an elevated position, the Germans had absolutely no idea where the fire was coming from. The casual, arrogant stroll of the German paratroopers instantly turned into total chaos. They scrambled for the ditches, pinned down by a wall of lead. Miles behind them in the column, Joachim Paper was looking at his watch. His tanks had suddenly stopped moving. The road was blocked. Paper was furious. His strict, aggressive timetable was the entire key to Hitler's offensive, and he was being delayed just hours into the attack. He demanded to know what was holding up his unstoppable Panzer army. The report came back: heavy American resistance in the village of Lanzerath. The arrogant German commanders assumed that because the crossfire was so disciplined, so intense, and so well coordinated, they had to be facing a massive, heavily reinforced American regiment. They thought there were hundreds, maybe thousands of troops on that ridge. Instead of moving around the ridge, which they easily could have done, the German officers let their pride take over. They decided to launch a direct, frontal assault to wipe out the Americans. They gathered their men, fixed bayonets, and charged up the freezing, snow-covered hill. Inside the foxholes, the farm boys were operating like machines. The fear was still there, gripping their chests, but muscle memory took over. They didn't spray their bullets wildly. They communicated. They called out targets. They conserved their ammunition. Every time a wave of German soldiers tried to rush the ridge, the boys beat them back. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then 4. The situation was growing incredibly desperate. The cold was seeping into their bones. Their hands were bleeding from reloading their weapons so fast. The Germans began bringing up heavy mortars and machine guns, chewing up the tree line. The deafening roar of explosions was constant. By mid-afternoon, Paper was practically losing his mind. His elite spearhead had been sitting idle for almost the entire day. The greatest surprise attack of the war was grinding to a halt because of a single hill. He ordered his men to take the ridge no matter the cost. Wave after wave rushed the American positions. And wave after wave was pushed back. But the 18 Americans were reaching their breaking point. The sun was starting to set, casting long dark shadows over the snow. They were completely exhausted, shaking from the freezing temperatures and the sheer adrenaline. Worse, they were almost completely out of ammunition. Guys were tossing their last clips to each other. They were fixing their own bayonets, preparing for hand-to-hand combat. They knew they couldn't hold out much longer. They hadn't eaten, they hadn't drank water, and they had been fighting continuously for nearly 10 hours. And then, the woods went dead silent. The firing stopped. The mortar shells ceased. The sudden quiet was almost heavier than the noise. The Americans looked at each other from across their foxholes. The fading light made it impossible to see through the trees. Then they heard the chilling sound of footsteps. Not down on the road, but right on top of them. The crunch of boots on the snow was coming from behind their positions. The perimeter had been breached. The Germans had finally flanked them. A shadow loomed over the pale winter sky above Lyle Bulge's foxhole. He looked up, his rifle empty. A metallic clink echoed in the dirt. A German grenade had just been dropped inside. The concussive blast was deafening. It threw Bulge violently against the frozen dirt wall, knocking the wind out of his lungs and leaving his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. Dirt and snow rained down on him. He was dazed, struggling to breathe, the world spinning around him in a blur of gray and white. Before he could fully regain his senses, rough hands grabbed his uniform. He was yanked out of the foxhole and thrown onto the frozen ground. When his vision finally cleared, Bulge looked around. The 18 American farm boys, covered in dirt, exhausted and completely out of ammo, had been pulled from their fighting positions. They were completely surrounded by heavily armed German paratroopers. Rifles were pointed at their chests. It was over. They were prisoners of war. A high-ranking German commander stepped forward. He looked at the teenagers shivering in the snow, disgusted that his massive force had been held up for so long. He demanded to speak to the officer in charge. Lyle Bulge, just 20 years old, stood up straight and said he was the commander. The German officer scoffed. He demanded to know where the rest of the American forces were hidden. He wanted to know where the massive regiment was deployed, where the heavy machine gun nests were, where the anti-tank weapons were concealed. Bulge looked the German commander dead in the eye and pointed to the 17 freezing, battered boys standing next to him. "This is it," Bauch said. "This is everyone." The absolute disbelief on the German commander's face was something the boys would never forget. The realization hit the German officers like a physical blow. There was no secret regiment. There was no heavy reinforced division. Hitler's unstoppable war machine, led by his most arrogant and highly decorated general, had been completely paralyzed for an entire crucial day by 18 teenagers with rifles. The psychological humiliation for the German command was staggering. But the strategic reality was catastrophic. You see, Joachim Paper's entire plan relied on speed. He had a massive amount of tanks but very limited fuel. He needed to capture American fuel dumps and road junctions within the first 24 hours to keep his army moving. Because Lyle Bauch and his farm boys held that single ridge at Lanzerath from dawn until dusk, Paper's timetable was completely destroyed. That 24-hour delay caused a massive traffic jam of German armor. But more importantly, that single day bought the American High Command the one thing they desperately needed: time. Because those 18 boys refused to run, the Allies had just enough time to realize what was happening and rush the 101st Airborne Division in trucks to a crucial crossroads town called Bastogne. By the time Paper's forces finally got moving again, the trap had been set. The element of surprise was gone. Hitler's last great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was doomed before it even truly began. And it wasn't broken by a massive army or brilliant generals in a war room. It was broken by a handful of kids who didn't know they were supposed to lose. Joachim Paper's arrogant dream of slicing through the American lines turned into a nightmare. His tanks eventually ran out of gas. His elite spearhead was surrounded, cut off, and completely destroyed. He was forced to abandon his beloved King Tiger tanks in the snow and retreat back to Germany on foot, his military legacy in ashes. As for the 18 farm boys, they spent the rest of the cold winter in brutal German prisoner-of-war camps. But every single one of those 18 boys who fought on that ridge survived the war. They came home. And true to their nature, they went back to their farms, their towns, and their quiet lives. For decades they never bragged about what they did. Most of their neighbors had no idea that they had single-handedly stopped the greatest military machine in the world. It wasn't until 37 years later, in 1981, that the United States government finally realized the massive strategic impact of what happened on that ridge. Lyle Bauch and his men were brought to Washington, D.C., where their tiny platoon became the most highly decorated unit of its size in the entire history of the United States Army. So the next time you think about the massive scale of history, remember the Ghost Front. Remember that sometimes the arrogance of empires and the grand plans of generals aren't undone by massive armies. Sometimes all it takes is 18 kids in the freezing cold who simply refuse to back down.